experts. This is Zaib, back with another episode. This is this is this is I think might be a little bit of a controversial one, but it is what it is. It is it is quite it is based on some recent events, and I guess you guys would know what I'm talking about as and when I start to elaborate on it. But um, I wanted to really, as I do usually with specific incidents, I try and generalize them and get to the meat of it and see what the y- trying to go deeper into that incident and try and get to the principle around it, and then perhaps have a conversation around that. And so therefore, I mean, if anyone listens to this, I don't know, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now, um, they would still be able to get something out of it and not wonder, what am I talking about? I mean, obviously there are certain episodes I do which are very specific to events, and difficult for them to really step out of those specific elements. But this one I feel like would be a little bit more general, but based out of a specific event. So just to set the stage, um, this discussion is happening on the back of um, the protests that we've seen in Pakistan, that I feel reached its epitome and its peak on the 9th of May. To anyone who doesn't know what happened on the 9th of May in Pakistan, I think they should Google, although they will come across some very interesting accounts, especially the media in Pakistan is it's not the most reliable um, institution, and this is not just one reason why, but there are many other reasons why. And anyone who feels otherwise, I have a bridge that they can buy. Um, so um, the protest. I mean, this conversation that I wanted to have had been brewing in my mind for a good part of a few months, but 9th May happened, and this kind of I was like, okay, now I really need to talk about it. It just added a little bit more color around what I wanted to say, but at the end of the day, it is kind of the similar conversation that I wanted to have. So, um, there have been political arrests, political protests, uh, without taking anyone's side right now, um, have going on for a few months. A lot of the things that uh, would be a sore eye for, I would assume, some of the folks in the media. I would assume some of the folks who've been very vocal on these things in the past. They were quite happy and actually enjoying the site, which is fine, because I think the people before them were also kind of doing the same thing. But and that's where I feel like it cancels those two reactions cancel each other out, and then nobody has a right to say anything anymore. You know what I mean? So um, so 9th May happened, and that got me thinking about you know the concept of protests and the concept around violent protest. And trust me, I went through the archives of the internet and really read a few articles, few researches that were done on violent protests in general, and the use cases around them. And um, the purpose was just to really understand what this is. So before I dive into the specifics around what I wanted to discuss, I think let's talk a little bit about the concept of protest. Um, what is a protest? In a classic democracy, in a very normal country, in a normal democracy, a protest is something that you would assume that citizens n- organizations, institutions, um, any class of people will will put up um, in order to change something about the status quo. I mean, if you really boil it down, a protest is just that, to tweak the change or change the status quo. The nature and the extent of the changes could be varying. Could be like I said, a slight tweak, or it could be a monumental change. It could be something really really big. But either way, protest is something that citizens, if I generalize this, citizens use as a tool to really get their voices heard against whatever they're seeing in the status quo. It could be rules, laws, could be potential laws, it could be um, rights or lack thereof. um, कुछ भी यानी कि कुछ भी हो सकता है इसमें. Pretty much anything can be used to or the grounds to protests. Um, the interesting thing about protest, I think in general, is what it really does is because you're protesting against the status quo. You're protesting, let's say, if I really simplify this, you're protesting against the rulers. You're protesting against the government of the time. You're protesting against the establishment of the time. Um, so the interesting things that happens here is that a question gets asked, like, who sets the rules of how a protest should be held? And the answer generally to that is the other side, the side that is being protested against, and that's usually the government. So the government will set the rules. So they will send down their paramilitary troopers, they will send out their police, they will send out their riot control uh, um, personnel, um, and they will define how a protest will be held. Now, a question that rises in my head at least is, um, how is it viable, and how is it okay for the side that you are protesting against to set the rules of the said protest? Um, it is quite interesting because you would think, for example, if there are um, two competing arguments, right, in a debate, in a conversation, in a conflict, um, you would need a third party mediator, 9.5 times out of 10 to resolve the issue between the two parties, or the two sets of ideas, or sets of people. Never you would assume that you would make one party the judge, jury, and the executioner, and let them perhaps kind of like set the rules for the game that is going to be played, because it hasn't been played yet. Nothing's happened yet. It's only people have just come out on the streets at this point, and now the other party starts. The opposing party, which is the party that you're protesting against, starts setting the rules that, okay, you can only protest here. You can only protest at this time. You can only do this while protesting. That you cannot shout slogans. You cannot throw rocks and stones. And we'll get to the violence around protest as well. I just wanted to say this. um, um, you will not enter these areas. These are the red lines. These are the areas that thou shall not cross. um, and I've always found that interesting, and I feel like that how you know um, counterproductive that is, to the whole equation, where people who've gotten out on the streets, they have gotten out against the very set so they will not if they follow rules, if they follow rules of the people that they're trying to protest against, they would not be protesting in the first place. That might be a dialogue, right? I mean, I guess what I should have started with is, how do people get to the point of protesting? प्रोटेस्ट की हद तक कोई इंसान किस तरीके से पहुंचता है? प्रोटेस्ट की हद तक इंसान उस हद को पार करके पहुँचता है कि जब अ, बातचीत का कोई इम्कान ना हो। जब तक आपको ये मालूम ना हो कि सामने वाला जो फ़रीक है आपकी कोई बात नहीं सुनेगा। और जब वो नहीं सुनेगा आपकी बात, तो आपके पास और कोई चारा नहीं बचता कि आप सड़कों पे आएँ और आप अपना हक जो है शोर से और ज़ोर से और अम, अ, एक 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 जमात की शक्ल में उसको आप मंज़ूर करवाएँ। जमात की मीनिंग कि बहुत सारे लोग हों। तो उसकी जो जो स्ट्रेंथ होती है उस जमात की, वो उसके साथ लोग होते हैं और वो एक समझ लेंगे एक पिक्चर पेंट करती है कि ओह माय गॉड! कि ये तो बहुत अच्छे खासे लोग हैं यहाँ पर। तो ऑब्वियसली दैट ड्रॉज़ अटेंशन, दैट ड्रॉज़ eyeballs to the situation and whatnot, so on and so forth. तो you get to the point of protest by knowing that this other party is not going to listen to me, so therefore I need to really scream, you know तो द फैक्ट है कि उस पॉइंट पे आकर भी वही लोग आपको बता रहे हैं कि ऐसे करना है, ऐसे नहीं करना, एंड आई थॉट अबाउट दिस द कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ द ब्लैक लाइव्स मैटर प्रोटेस्ट couple of years ago, 2020 actually, 3 years ago, um, actually around this very time in the summer of 2020. um, और मैं सोचता था कि जो वो जिनके खिलाफ वो प्रोटेस्ट कर रहे, they were protesting against the police, they were protesting against the the established elite of the country. I mean, and I say they very lightly because I don't mean the organization BLM. I meant the people who are actually impacted. Organization that is BLM, we'll talk about it some other time. That's a whole array of discussion in itself. But um, उस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में मैं सोच रहा था कि यार वो तो प्रोटेस्ट ही इस चीज़ के ऊपर कर रहे हैं कि ये पुलिस हमारे साथ अनफेयर है, तो पुलिस के सामने फिर वो how are the police setting directions and boundaries for how they should protest, and then the people like media के खिलाफ वो protest करें कि media हमको एक villain बना के पेश हमको as in the African Americans हमको एक villain बना के पेश करती है, and then and the media itself then starts dictating the ethics and moralities around how one should protest and how shouldn't they protest, कि violent नहीं होना चाहिए, peaceful होना चाहिए, ऐसे करो शोर नहीं मचाओ, ये ना बोलो, dude, you are the one in discussion. You're the one part of the conversation here. How are you setting the rules for me on how I should protest and how I shouldn't protest? तो उस कॉन्टेक्स्ट से मैंने ये 3-4 साल 2-3 साल पहले सोचना शुरू किया था, and then when this happened, this applied beautifully again. I mean, it applies to pretty much every protest in the world, to be honest. क्योंकि like I said, protest, उस फेस पे आप पहुँचते ही तब हो। Um, तो इट्स क्वाइट इंटरेस्टिंग कि हु सेट्स द रूल्स, राइट? कि रूल्स कौन सेट कर रहा होता है? बट देन अ क्वेश्चन कैन बी आस्क्ड कि भाई चलो ठीक है, अगर आप रूल सेट नहीं कर सकते एज़ इन लाइक द पार्टी प्रोटेस्टिंग और वो रूल नहीं सेट कर सकते हु द protestees are, I guess, if that's a word, then who should set the rules? Um, ये एक फिर बहुत बड़ा एक पेंडोरा बॉक्स खुल जाएगा, because what it does here at this stage is opens a very important question around why it gets to that stage, ठीक है? क्योंकि अगर अ, आपको लगता है कि आप एक अम, ऐसी फ़िज़ा में जी रहे हो कि जहाँ पर आपकी हुकूमत आपकी बात प्रोटेस्ट के बगैर नहीं मानेगी। Um, so that already talks about the lack of, you know, um, lack of trust between the two parties. तो फिर वो आपको it's not about protest anymore. It's about filling that gap of of trust. तो the fact that you're asking me कि अच्छा ये नहीं करेंगे तो कौन करेगा, right? Rules set on how one should protest. फिर वो बात आ जाती है moralities and ethics of protests. वो फिर हम एंड में बात करते हैं इसके बारे में. Let's talk about that towards the end. कि मोरालिटी, क्योंकि इसके साथ एक और चीज़ कनेक्टेड है जिसको मैं एड्रेस करना चाहता हूँ, तो we'll speak about that. But before I do that, I think it's important to also then talk about, okay, the problem isn't how you're protesting, the problem is the lack of trust. That should be the again, this is what happens, okay. You you um you you create these environments and then you spend your energies and time wasting at focusing on the wrong things. um इसलिए मुझे थोड़ा-सा वो it 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 bothers me when people just go and, bring up irrelevant questions, because that's, a question to be addressed later down the line. It's not a question to be addressed right now. Um, तो हमने रूल्स की बात करी कि who should be setting the rules, but what we do know कि the people who are protesting against, it doesn't make sense for them to set the rules, because आप ही से तो मसला है हमें, right? आप ही से तो प्रॉब्लम है. You are the problem. And because we don't have that level of trust where we can talk to you and we feel like you will not be um, you cannot be trusted, you will not be forefront with your thinking and your ideas, you might be stabbing me in the back. तो हमें पूरा हक है कि हम थोड़ा सा सड़क पे आए, शोर मचाएं, क्योंकि आप ही से तो मसला है हमें. ठीक है, तो आप हमें नहीं बताएंगे कि किस तरीके से प्रोटेस्ट करनी चाहिए. अम, तो और कहाँ करनी चाहिए, because that's also very important, because a lot of conversation around the 9th May thing was happening around कि यार sensitive installations, uh, public places, के बाहर और के पास, you shouldn't, because it's again फिर वो मेरा what is more important, again the question arises here again. I hate doing this, but it is unfortunately the way it is. कि what's more important, right? It feels to me कि installations, um, monuments, this idea is more important than the human itself. These places are great and all, and they represent something, which is fine. But I also feel like it just starts to overstates the importance of these places, especially when it comes up against the lives of human beings. um, कि यार अब क्या करें, लाइक वो अगर आ रहे हैं मिलिट्री इंस्टॉलेशंस के बाहर, and they're you know uh, being physical and violent in that area, we'll have to shoot them down and kill them. Why? I don't understand. And I think this is a very good segue into talking about violence in protests. I may not, reach some sort of a conclusion, and I have in my head at least, or at least I think so. But in this podcast, in this episode, I'm not gonna try and lead you towards a conclusion when it comes to violent protests. What I will do is pose some questions, because hopefully that intrigues you into doing some of your own research and thinking about these things yourself. Um, um, the potency and the value of protests is known. अब हमने बात कर ली उसके बारे में कि भाई, कि अगर आप दो पार्टीज के दरमियान अगर वो ट्रस्ट एग्जिस्ट नहीं करता, then obviously the next step is to really get loud on the streets, show strength of people, so that your demands could be heard. ठीक है. अगर वो चैनल एग्जिस्ट करता कि भाई फॉर एग्जांपल, अगर हम एक छोटी सी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन स्कूल का एग्जांपल लें, राइट? स्कूल में, if you want to complain against the teacher for whatever they did, or the principal, or the board of directors and whatnot, so you would perhaps start by writing a complaint, get the parents, all of the parents, most of the parents, to sign on it, and then send it to जहाँ पर भी उन्होंने एक वो बनाया हो दफ्तर या ऑफिस या the means to get the complaints from, like a complaint box, or like email to the trustees or whatever, right? um and then if that doesn't get heard, and that happens for an extended period of time, where whenever a complaint happens, it never gets heard. So what really usually follows is parents lining up outside of the school and saying, hey, we're here like 100 people here. We want to talk to the principal. This is getting too much. We're not getting listened to. That's a form of protest. That is a protest. ठीक है ना? When you show up physically. So that happened because the inefficiencies that lies in the first line of defense, which is addressing the problem at its root. So um, again, man, I digressed. I was talking about protest and the potency of violence in it. But again, I want to stress in this more than more than once, I guess. Okay, it doesn't need to get to the stage. The fact that it does, it has so much to do with how the first line of defense really does its job, which is awful. So in example of a school, had complaints been addressed proactively, and not reactively, while after 100 people show up uh, you know at your door, it we would not be in this position, because then once that happens, every other parent knows now, okay, going forward, writing a complaint might not be the most effective way to get things done here. We might need to get a few people around, and then तो ये सब चीज़ें कंटिन्यूएशन है मेरी जान। ये सब चीज़ें आपको पहले से देखने को मिल रही हैं। ये सब चीज़ें ये दिस इज़ नॉट एन आइसोलेशन कि भाई ये अभी हो गया। So, so again, this is a continuation of lack of trust, at least in the Pakistan's atmosphere, that has been going on for decades. So, um, violence. So yeah. So whenever a protest takes place, the idea of the protest is to get their point across, to get what they want, to have at least you know a negotiation, get the other party who hasn't been listening so far, get the other party to feel like they're obliged to at least come to the negotiations table and give them what they want. ठीक है? So again, the protest in itself is taking place so that the other party can come and at least listen, because they haven't listened so far. So they're trying different ways to get the other party's attention. ठीक है ना? बच्चे हैं जिनके they were attested this कि when if you're not listening, if you're ignoring your child, especially if they're a toddler, they will start doing really crazy shit. They'll start jumping, or they will start making noise, or they will start really going a because they want attention. ठीक है? So if you would give them attention when they actually needed it in the first place, they wouldn't perhaps get to that stage. But again, I digress. तो उस कॉन्वर्जेशन में जब वायलेंस आ जाता है, वायलेंस भी आप समझ लें कि इज अ स्टेप। आप उसको देयर आर लेवल्स टू प्रोटेस्ट, राइट? देयर प्रोटेस्ट व्हेन जब 100 लोग खड़े हो गए आके, principal comes out, immediately listens to them, immediately says, okay, you know what, I apologize, sorry, I didn't notice it was such a big issue, I didn't read the complaint, blah blah, let me address this, let's talk right now. Okay, everybody goes to the drawing room and talk, ठीक है? But वो 100 बंदा स्कूल के बाहर खड़ा हुआ है, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, so on and so forth, पूरा हफ्ता खड़ा रहा है, nothing happens. What happens now? Do you think they're stupid? They're just going to keep standing there? That's what the media wants you to believe. That's what the so-called the rules setters, which is the government, कि भाई देखो, protest करनी है peacefully, चुपचाप खड़े हुए करो, शोर ना मचाना. How is that going to change anything? You're already not listening. If शोर ना मचाना was the solution, तो मैं अगर खत लिख देता, या मैं कोई कंप्लेंट बॉक्स के अंदर अपनी कंप्लेंट डाल देता, that would have been equally, that in this instance it's has an equal impact. क्योंकि अगर मैं शोर ना बजाऊं, चुपचाप खड़ा रहूं, कुछ ना करूं, and you're going to listen to me, or this is going to work, then it should have worked in the first place. It didn't. That's why I'll have to raise my voice. And if that means hurling a few stones at your door to get your attention, again, to get your fucking attention. So the problem isn't on the people who are trying to get your attention. It's the problem is the people who are not listening. And often you see media, often you see fucking analysts, often you see God, I have so many adjectives, but these people try and convince you that people who are subjects citizens are equal to people who are military, people who are establishments, people who are politicians, people who are rulers and governments. The reason why they do that is because they say कि वायलेंस की कोई जगह नहीं है प्रोटेस्ट में. ठीक है, ऑन प्रिंसिपल आई काइंड ऑफ लाइक बहुत अच्छी बात है अगर ये ड्राइंग रूम में बैठ के लाइक दिस हम ये बातें कर रहे हैं और बोलेंगे प्रोटेस्ट में ना वायलेंस नहीं होना चाहिए, आराम आराम से बात करनी चाहिए, यू शुड बी. Fuck that. It doesn't work like that in the real world. A imbalance of power already exists when you are a citizen protesting against the government. The government has all the arsenal, all the machinery to really whoop your ass. Really make sure that you're never seen. They can pick you up and disappear you. They can kill you. They can make you absolutely irrelevant. They can even force you to migrate and exile. They can do whatever the fuck they want. The imbalance of power already exists in that relationship. How are you expecting in an imbalanced relationship that the other party who is subject to that imbalance, for them to take care of the feelings of the other party? No. If anyone needs to crouch a little bit, if anyone needs to come off their high horse a little bit, it's the powerful, quote unquote, powerful party. Yeah, or yeah, the powerful party in the conflict. ठीक है, which in this instance is the government establishment and all of that. उनको नहीं चाहना पड़ेगा, उनको अपने rules थोड़े से flexible करने पड़ेंगे, because they are in a position. I mean, if you're again going back to the toddler example, if uh the reason why your parents are calm, and parents don't tend to lose their head if a child slaps them on the face, it's because they know if they slap them back the child's going to get hurt really badly. ठीक है ना? तो the rules of the engagement, kind of like the rules of war does not apply to a child. ठीक है? So what happens in that instance, in in that exchange, is that you recognize कि यार देखो, I am the powerful one here in this relationship. I have the economic benefits over this child. I literally feed this child. Let me try and reason with them. Let me try and calm them down. So you take a little bit of a punches, you take a few punches, and you calm them down a little bit and say, okay, you know what, that's fine, it's fine, let's say. So the way you engage with a child is how I feel like governments should be engaging with protesters, even if they get violent. Now, a question arises. This is what I wanted to get to, um, which is a fair question, to be honest. Okay, doesn't this give a license to anybody to then um, have a few hundred people, thousand people on the streets and basically strong arm the government into whatever they need? Just go. हम कहते हैं, there's this term that gets thrown around, January 6th, by the way, as well, in the US, and May 9th, the writ of the government. ठीक है, writ of the government को challenge नहीं करना चाहिए. ठीक है. Good question. मैं इसमें कोई, it came to my head. I was, when I was thinking about these things, I was like, this is a fair question. This is a fair question, and I want to address it. But before that, I really want to finish the thought on violent protests and the potency of violent protests. If you really go back in history, take it. If you go back in history, if you look at what gets achieved um, as a result of protests, civil balances that were achieved in the 1960s when it came to uh, the rights of the African Americans, the civil rights movement. Um, it had its fair share of quote unquote violence. I mean, heck, Martin Luther King, was had cases on him, FBI cases of him inciting violence. He's the most non-violent person. Now we know, people associate nonviolence with him so much. He had fucking cases on him. um so that's what happens, right? When at the time, people try and malign you, and they set the rules. I mean, everybody knows this. There were articles in newspapers, absolutely having a go at MLK at the time. Now the same articles will celebrate MLK Day, right? Same newspapers. So they were having a go at MLK, thinking of him some like violent uh, right leader, riot leader, not rights leader, um, and totally like had a go at him and his party for whatever they were asking for, which again wasn't much. But um, the usefulness of violence and protests, it's, I don't want to say this, but it is what it is. I mean, it is useful. But what it depends is, this is where kind of like we go into the ethics of it, the moralities around it. Okay, what are you violent against? If you're violent against people, your co-citizens, उनकी प्रॉपर्टी अगर बर्न हो रही है या उनकी प्रॉपर्टीज अगर impacted हो रही हैं, then I feel like that's the line no one should cross, because they're not, it's not their fault. ठीक है? Even अगर हम fault के ऊपर बात करें कि अगर for example we're protesting in the police, the guy who's standing in front of me, the police guy, it's technically not his fault, but if you know he's involved in that, so technically I shouldn't be hurting them. But they're resisting against on behalf of the institution, so they are the institution for all I know. ठीक है? क्योंकि individual पे नहीं देखा जाता. ठीक है? uh, um, uh, for example, when the rioters, then when the riot police starts smashing you on the other side, they're smashing you disparately. They're smashing you without seeing you in your faces. जिसका हाथ आया, जिसका पैर आया, उस पर लाठी गई. ठीक है? And if they're starting to shoot you down, they'll shoot you down without recognizing कि इनमें से कौन था जो actually was a little bit reasonable, but he was just here. इसमें से कौन था जो थोड़ा violent था या नहीं था. They're not taking that consideration. So why should the other party? ठीक है? तो whatever वो जो जवाब बोले वो अपने लिए इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं, वही सेम चीज़ यहाँ अप्लाई करेगी. Um, but violence in protest is anything above raising your voice. 100 बंदा सड़क पे आके खड़ा होता है, आवाज़ ऊँची ना करे अपनी और बस बैनर्स लेके खड़े हो जाए, फॉर देम दैट इज़ पीसफुल प्रोटेस्ट. अब वो अगर खड़े होके नारे भी लगाएँगे ना, तो वायलेंस में एक लेयर ऑफ वायलेंस उसपे ऐड हो जाएगा, फिर उसमें आप वायलेंस ऐड करते जाओ, पत्थर फेंकना, लड़ना, डंडे मारना, व्हाटएवर जो भी करना, इट गोज़ up a level. Lekin violence technically starts the moment you raise your voice on the streets, because that's violence when you say, screw you, and we need our rights and all of that. It is a violent behavior. It is not peaceful behavior. ठीक है? Peaceful protest, what they consider is कि आप सड़क पे जाके खामोशी से खड़े हो जाओ और कुछ ना बोलो. Maybe even have play cards in front of your like in your hands. That's it. But even that, sometimes people think it's very aggressive to have those play cards in your hand. I mean, just ask the Aurat March folks, and people and their detractors what they feel about play cards. So people consider play cards as violence as well. So, like, again, I'm just assuming for the sake of argument, so violence is anything above not raising your voice in a protest. So, if you tell me कि वायलेंस की प्रोटेस्ट में कोई जगह नहीं है, तो लिटरली नो ह्यूमन राइट्स, सिविल राइट्स मूवमेंट्स, चेंजेस जो अचीव हुए हैं इन द पास्ट 100-200 years will cease to exist, because they all at least had them raising their voice, so had some element of violence in them. तो उसकी वायलेंस की एफिकेसी तो आपके सामने है. ठीक है? अब वो टाइप ऑफ वायलेंस क्या है, जिसमें हमने थोड़ी सी बात करना शुरू कर दी कि भाई इज इट ओके टू देन बर्न, लाइक फॉर एग्जांपल मेरा घर है. ठीक है? अब मेरे घर के सामने अगर कोई प्रोटेस्ट हो रहा है अगेंस्ट द गवर्नमेंट, ठीक है, अब द प्रोटेस्टर स्टार्ट्स यू नो stoning my house or like throwing something in my house or start to burn my house. I got nothing to do with it. I'm their co-citizen. I'm not even resisting against them. So I think no one on either each side of the aisle would disagree here and say, "कि नहीं यार, ये भी, part of the protest." Even the protesters themselves, if you ask them afterwards, they were like, "Yeah, that was too much." That person had nothing to do with it. They were not even standing it. They were not resisting. So people who were not part of the equation, bystanders, co-citizens, whatever, they are unke against violence. Obviously, it's not justifiable. But when it comes to public property, who's the public? You mean the public who's protesting or the public who's being protested against? Who's the public in those? Okay, the public who's protesting is the public. Okay, so they can't burn the properties of the public. Um, um, an argument can be made it is unfortunate to do that, but and again an extension of what the first argument was कि भाई जो लोग involved नहीं है, public just जो involved नहीं है, co-citizens की कोई property को आप damage ना करो. Throwing stones at the parliament, burning down the core commander house. you know, I don't know. I'm not gonna put any words in your mouth or thoughts in your head. Um, yeah, I mean, I gotta be careful with these things because people can take whatever they want to take out of it. But I also want to be very mindful of my own conscience and what I'm trying to say here. But without putting anything forward, what I will definitely say here at this कि violence and protest or जो मैं violence describe किया अभी पूरा, it's again, don't take this out of context, but violence and protest is necessary to get things done. um the extent, the boundaries around it, that needs to be defined. That needs to be, we can converse about that, and that gets us to the point of कि ये तो कोई भी कर ले, कोई भी झत्ता आ जाए, और then um, um, you know they can have thousands of people on the streets and get whatever they want. क्या ऐसा होना चाहिए? Rid of the government कहाँ चलेगी? Where is the rid of the government if this starts to happen? um Answer number one, okay, it, like I said, the first thing, it only happens when you're not listening. Okay, so address the first line of defense, which is listening. um Develop that trust, give everybody the idea, "ठीक है यार, we don't need to get our," nobody likes to do that, by the way. Nobody likes to get out in the fucking sun and scream their organs out to get what they want. Nobody likes to do that. Might be some people who are cynical enough to enjoy it, but I mean, for the majority of them, they're there just because they need to get shit done. Otherwise, they don't need to do that. They want to stay home, spend time with their families and friends, have fun. Maybe some people might think of that as fun, but that's just some of them, not most of them. So my answer to that, first thing, get your first line of defense sorted. um the other thing is the cause. Again, I try and argue about these things. Okay, moralities and ethics aren't relative. They can never be relative. ठीक है. Therefore, जो मैं argument पेश कर रहा हूँ, it's actually for relative morality and relative ethics. But I'm presenting this from a point of view of it being, there being an absolute morality, an absolute ethical code. Um, so what are they protesting for? What are they protesting against? ये सब चीज़ें मैटर करती हैं, ठीक है? क्या क्या एक रूल एग्जिस्ट करता है कि फलां प्रोटेस्ट कर सकता है, फलां नहीं कर सकता? नो। अब उनका राइट है, वो प्रोटेस्ट करेंगे, ठीक है ना? अब लेकिन क्या दे हैव द सेम स्टैंडिंग in the eyes of that absolute morality and absolute code of ethics as people who don't as people who abide by the absolute morality and absolute ethics? No. No sane person can make that argument. For example, एक तरफ आपकी protest हो रही है to raise minimum wage, ठीक है, to make wage more livable, to improve the lives of the citizens, ठीक है. एक तरफ protest हो रही है to um I don't know क्या बोलूँ मैं. Example, पाकिस्तानी कॉन्टेक्स्ट में लेते हैं. फॉर एग्जाम्पल टीएलपी, ठीक है. TLP were protesting against uh, there not be any rationality around the blasphemy laws in the country. This was like a few years ago. Um, अभी मैंने बहुत general इसको description किया है, इसमें बहुत specifics थी, but let's just assume that's the case. The one party is protesting against the lack of rationality, protesting against there being a lack of rationality in the blasphemy laws. The other party is protesting against livable, for livable wages. ठीक है. तो आप लोगों की, your moralities and your ethics, which protest do you feel like is much closer to the absolute morality? One might argue कि blasphemy again, but if the argument in the TLP's cases was that more people should be hanged and killed because of the blasphemy laws, or they should have enough power to do that themselves. So again, although in this instance I'm saying कि यार आप relative देखो, protest किसके बारे में हो रही है, context check करो कि protest क्या हो रही है protest. I'm trying to give you an excuse or an argument for looking at context. ठीक है, which might some might argue say कि मैं relative morality की तरफ बात कर रहा हूँ. मैं कह रहा हूँ कि morality क्योंकि इनको it's okay for them to protest and be a little bit violent, quote unquote violent, and not for this other party to be violent because it's wrong. What they're so I'm being relative in my morality. Yes, on face of it does seem that way, but in the eyes of absolute morality, in the eyes of absolute, there being an absolute code of conduct, ethical code of conduct, so everything else is relative, right? उसके कंपैरिजन में तो हर कोई relative ही होगी नहीं बात. मैं बात कर रहा हूँ कि जो absolute morality exist करती है, मतलब absolute code exist करता है और जो करना चाहिए. My argument will be कि यार you cannot live by my moralities and my ethical code of conduct, and I can't live by yours. And if that's the case, then we'll have a billion code of conducts and a billion uh, uh, code of moralities. उनमें से किसी एक को तो सही होना है या सबको गलत तो होना ही है at the very least. लेकिन कोई एक सही जरूर होना चाहिए. ठीक है. What is that one correct one? That we have to find. So there has to be a correct one. ठीक है. Which one of them is that? Again, it is a journey towards that we're trying to undertake. Um, I don't know if I made any sense to you guys. It was especially that last 5-10 minutes. But it is what it is. These things that take around us, happen around us, take us to you know these questions, these big questions in life. Okay, what is the truth? What is right and what is wrong? Um, and then you know hopefully pushes you towards getting an answer to that. So this is what this was about. Honestly, I mean, I have nothing else to really say, um, other than the fact subscribe to the channel on YouTube if you like what you hear. Leave us a rating on Spotify, um, on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Amazon, Samsung Podcast, Podbean, wherever you're listening to us. Subscribe and leave us a rating. Encourage the show, encourage me to um, continue with this. I'm just thinking if I need to add anything to what I just said. No. Um, no, I think I've touched pretty much I don't know अब मुझे नहीं मालूम कि इससे बेहतर मैं क्या बोलूँ? यू नो इससे बेहतर मैं आर्गुमेंट क्या पेश करूँ आप लोगों के सामने कि मोरालिटीज़ जो है ना रिलेटिव होती हैं या एब्सोल्यूट होती हैं। तो इट इज़ अ क्वेश्चन टू बी आस्क्ड आई मीन मैंने जो एक पूरा एक केस बिल्ड किया है फॉर प्रोटेस्ट्स डिस्क्राइबिंग व्हाट वायलेंस इज़ एंड व्हाई वायलेंस टेक्स प्लेस उसमें तो ये सब चीज़ें क्वेश्चंस तो आएँगे। अब जो मैंने केस बिल्ड किया है उसका अगर वो सही है इफ ए प्लस बी इज इक्वल टू सी तो अगर ए और बी दोनों ठीक हैं तो सी उसका जवाब भी ठीक होना चाहिए ठीक है दिस इज अ फिलोसॉफिकल आर्ग्यूमेंट ठीक है कि अब मैंने जो केस और जो आपके सामने रखा है अबाउट the rights of protesters about the rationale behind violence in protest अगर वो सही है and I think it is so these questions will have an answer and the answer to them is always in my head I go back to the absolute moralities and the absolute ethical values that I try and adhere to. Um, और वो मुझे उसका जवाब देते हैं एंड आई गेट माय रिस्पॉन्स फ्रॉम दैट रिलेटिव मोरालिटीज में उसका कोई जवाब नहीं मिलेगा आपको बिकॉज इट्स गोना बी रिलेटिव I mean, ठीक है यार ठीक है one side is okay and the other side is not then it just dissolves the whole thing and that raises the question on my case that I built which it shouldn't because we've all decided, we've all at least, I mean, I'm just pushing this decision your way, but I'm sure you will agree with the case that I've created in the first place. So yeah, that's that. I don't want to like again go on and on about this. I can perhaps do a part two on it with other people to see if I am making sense to them and perhaps gauge if did it this makes sense or not. But anyway, I'll be back with another one. Thanks, guys. Hopefully this helps. Cheers. Bye.